Hello you lovely lot and welcome to another video. My name's Katie and we're gonna do the Scrolltober, which is their Inktober version, list, all in one go. I decided to keep the medium itself pretty simple and just stuck to using the Sakura Micron pens, with the addition of one or two other liner pens, but they're all the same variety of pen there, and I just wanted to keep this a monochrome picture. So as well as doing Inktober, which I promise I will post some up on Instagram, I have posted a few already, but I kind of just don't keep getting around to doing it, but I have done quite a lot of them at this stage. But I didn't want to face doing another 31 separate pictures, which is why I decided to do all of the prompts in one go. And speaking of prompts, I'll quickly whiz through what is on the list. So number 1, pinecone. 2, slugs and snails. 3, circus. 4, moth. 5, relic. 6, hedgehog. 7, scales. 8, desire. 9, mask. 10, 11, opal. 12, spirit. 13, double. 14, tangle. 15, blackberry. 16, toxic. 17, empress. 18, midnight. 19, wild. 20, stag. 21, boots. 22, sugar and spice. 23, Scorpio. 24, purity. 25, bear. 26, marigold. 27, hare. 28, deity. 29, mineral. 30, fern. And 31, haunted. And of course, if you add that on top of the Inktober ones, that would be a lot of individual drawings. And hey, you know what? It's more of a challenge chucking them all onto one sheet, right? Well, yes it is. So some of those prompts we are going to have to use our imagination a little bit here. For example, relic, I am doubling that up as being the scales, and they're this ancient relic of, well, weighing slugs and snails with scorpions against sugar and spice. Mineral and opal kind of fall into that same bracket there too, as does tangle and wild, and I kind of do this a little bit throughout the picture just to make it a little bit more coherent. I mean, it is quite a crazy conception what's come out of this. Now, as you'll see, I had originally penciled all of this out at the start of the video, but it's one of those drawings or one of those pieces where I do have to go through and make the odd adjustment and just add the additional details here and there before I commit to adding the ink, because let's face it, you can't really go back from when you've added the ink on there. It was really good having a nice selection of nibs to work with. I actually found that the PN nib that came with the Micron set I'm using was actually much better to add the darker, more blocked out areas than actually using the brush nib. The brush nib did get that initial layer down, however it just didn't quite give it the good even coverage that I wanted, so using that PN nib was perfect for that job. And of course, using the extra fine nibs for the extra fine details worked out really well. I do recommend, I mean, you don't have to buy the set, but I do recommend you have a good selection of nibs if you're going to attempt something like this yourself, or in general with sort of these black and white pictures that I do here. So let's talk about what's going on right now. So the character in the middle is an empress, and on her head is a circus-shaped crown, like a circus tent. Below that, it is adorned with a moth, and I thought that was a good way of just tying those three in. She's holding a mask, and she's also wearing boots. Behind her is, I guess, the deity of death. See, I told you I was going to elaborate a little bit. And I did originally write poison on the bottle, but I thought let's just make it super obvious and write toxic on there. Behind her, she is haunted by a spirit, which has a desire to be free from, well, maybe the Empress? Who knows? With the Empress's long flowing robes, she is sitting upon a bear, and beneath her there is a hedgehog and a hare. As I mentioned earlier, the scales are going to be a relic in this piece here, and yes, they are holding the slugs, the snails and the scorpion on one side and being measured up against sugar and spice on the other side. At the bottom of the Empress's dress there are ferns, and as you'll see there are 10 of them, so I'm pretty sure I managed to cover that one. And growing up the side of the border there are some blackberries, and at the top of the border there are some pine cones. The scales themselves are adorned with a stag's head, and there are 2 marigolds either side of it, well at least my attempt to draw them, but you'll see them a little later on in the video. But I thought with the addition of 2 marigolds we've covered double there. The background is black and I have adorned it with stars just so you extra know that it is midnight there too. And the Empress is holding an opal, which just so happens to be a mineral at the same time. That's what I'm going to go with. Now the placement of how the blackberries are is not entirely symmetrical, which is where the wild idea comes from, and the spirit with all the little strands coming up with the spirit, well that's going to be Tangle as well. So as you can see, with a little bit of elaboration, we have our reasons for putting the prompts where they are and how they are. Anyway, whilst I've been yammering on about that, let's talk about the techniques here. So I know you guys enjoy watching me draw hair, and wonderfully we have 2 types of hair colours on here. For this one I wanted to make sure I did an extra special job, so I used the finest nibs I'd got, which was the 0.003 through to 0.005. I wanted to make sure that the hair strands and the textures really showed through, and by building up layers, by going from the finest nib towards the thickest, I think I do end up using a 0.1 or a 0.1. As well as that PN nib, just to add a bit of depth in there, and of course that lovely hair texture that I do quite enjoy drawing. Once I'd completed the Empress's hair, it was time to start filling in that background which I mentioned earlier, and I tend to find the areas which require a little bit of precision, I tend to go around that in a nib first, and then carefully block out the areas and eventually help it all join together. I must let you know, even by using the PN nib, I still had to go over the majority of these blocked out areas twice because it just wasn't quite giving the coverage I expected it to in general. And I guess because I'm using liners and rather than dipping a brush into some ink and applying it that way, obviously there were areas that needed going over more than once. For the hair of the spirit, obviously I wanted everything to be light and floaty, so I did the bare minimum of black outlining on here. I added just enough details there to at least emphasise that there were strands of hair or chunks of hair. I guess that's a bit of an odd word to use, but you know what I mean. And that just gave the basic form and shape and direction that this hair was moving in. Again, making sure to adjust the nib size I used to ensure that there was a bit of consistency there, and obviously for the more delicate areas I just added it in with that finer nib. However, it was looking a little bit sparse and unbalanced, and I do decide to go in there with a grey liner pen, and I believe it was the Derwent line maker. And that just made sure that I'd still got those details in there. You could still tell it was flowing hair, but I wasn't overwhelming the piece by just using black ink, and I quite like how it turned out. It also just gave some nice tonal variations in there too. But speaking of tonal variations, I didn't actually want to add too much to the bodies of the spirit or the Empress. I actually really wanted them to stand out, and I think by adding additional tones in there, even for shadowed areas, I think it just would have overwhelmed things a little bit. I mean, there is a lot going on here. At this stage though, I was a little on the fence as to whether I was going to do that. I wanted to at least get the majority of everything drawn in and blocked out first before making any decisions like that, because after all, if I leave it to the end, then I've not made any mistakes that I can't go back from. So we are looking at the circus-shaped crown for our Empress here, or tiara. I thought that would just be a fun inclusion for that prompt. I wasn't entirely sure when I was thinking about doing this particular design how I would incorporate a circus in there. I thought about doing something with the bear, but I thought again though that's not really massively in keeping. Although saying that though, this is such a random menagerie of items placed into one picture, it's hard to know what would be in keeping and what wouldn't, right? For the bear, and I guess for the hare, which I drew in earlier, the same approach as for drawing the Empress's hair. This is getting confusing. The Empress's hair and the hare. So for the bear hair, and the hare, and the hedgehog hair, as well as the hedgehog spines, which that'll be a little later on in the video, I started in there with a fine nib, and again, just like when I drew in the Empress's hair, adjust the nibs appropriately. For areas that were cast in shadow, I would use a slightly thicker nib, as well as making those marks a little bit more dense. For the lighter areas, then it's working in reverse really, less lines to be made and finer nibs to be used when I'm making those lines. I know the bear looks a little bit odd here, but I kind of like how it turned out. It's got its own thing going on there. And to be honest, that was one of the areas where I kind of struggled to fit it in. I definitely wanted her perched on a bear, but every time I tried to draw her directly sitting on it, it looked a little bit odd. So I just thought, well, let's just add a block of black ink in there and integrate it into the bear's fur, and hopefully that'll be fine. And I'm kind of happy with how it turned out. And once I'd established the form, the tone, everything with the bear, it was time to start drawing in those details I'd been putting off. For example, the Empress's legs, the hands, the mask. I mean, nobody really likes drawing hands, do they? And I'll be honest, it was pretty stressful doing this bit. I was half tempted to do it off camera just so I could really get close to the page, but I thought, no, I'm going to be brave and I'm just going to go for it. And it turned out okay. I thought about adding some additional shadows underneath where the pines and the blackberries are, curling up the border there, as well as starting to add some of those grey tones onto the ferns as well, because it was getting a little bit complicated to look at. But I am glad I did this because it just added a bit of depth in there, and again it just helped to differentiate between which fern was which fern. Now, I usually try and draw some form of Sonic the Hedgehog when I'm doing an Inktober list, and yeah, I will be doing a Sonic the Hedgehog. You'll just have to wait for whichever prompt I decide to integrate it into. But obviously I couldn't do a Sonic the Hedgehog on this picture, so we just went for a regular hedgehog. I kind of like the fact it's just peeping out from underneath the dress there, and again, same techniques applied with drawing the spines. Now for the deity of death, and that's what I'm going to stick with. I started off by just getting the basic form and line work in there before moving on to any details. I wanted to make sure that what I was committing to was exactly how I liked it. I went round and refined the edges of the cloak Death was wearing, and again it just tidied things up a little bit there. And although the robes are going to be very dark on there, I still wanted to make sure I'd just got the line work for where the creases were and the fabrics overlapped, so when it came to adding those details in, I could do it quite confidently. So I first started off by just adding a bit of tonal detail there on the skull, and I thought whilst I've got the grey pen out, I'd just colour in the Empress's lips, because why not? And I wanted quite a raggedy looking crosshatch for the actual texture of the fabric, and I kind of like the sharp contrast between that's sort of heavily textured robes compared to the fine clothes that the Empress will be wearing. Once I'd got a good foundation down by adding the grey, I went over it in some black ink and just kept building up those layers. And again, for areas that were in shadow, I would use more dense lines, and for areas where it was in the light and there were highlights, I just held back a little bit there just so it would stand out. I do additionally go over some of these areas in a Faber-Castell Pitt pen in a, I guess, medium to light grey. But unfortunately during that segment my memory card had run out at that point, and unfortunately I wasn't able to film it. But don't worry, there is some Pitt pen action still to watch on this video, so you're not missing out. So whilst that's going on in the background, I'm going to ask you guys, have you participated in Scrolltober and are you enjoying it? I was going to release this video at the end of the month, but I have something else planned for that instead. So, you know, all the best of luck to you guys who are participating. And if you're watching this sometime after, then I hope you managed to complete it. Or if you're thinking about just doing it for funsies, good luck. It's quite a fun list. You know, I should have mentioned this at the start of the video, but I guess you guys better know the surface I'm working on is fluid watercolour paper in the hot press finish, and it's a 300 GSM. I am quite partial to a hot press watercolour paper, not only just for watercolours, but for drawing on too. I just like the surface there. And for this particular paper, I liked the format it came in. I kind of like different paper sizes, and this narrow format just seemed to fit in quite well with what I had in mind for this picture. So I'm now at the stage of this drawing where it's time to just kick back, relax, and start adding some of those nice finishing touches in there. And I thought, whilst I was doing that the Empress could actually wear a black dress. I had originally kept the idea in mind of keeping it white, but to be honest, I don't think it was going to do the lower half of the picture any good. I thought it needed a good contrast there, so I ended up filling it in with the black, and it just created a much more balanced piece overall, in my opinion anyway. I also decided to start adding the finishing touches around the stag's head and the scales area, which is kind of funny because that's kind of where this all started off, and it's a little odd to be leaving it to the last, but you know what? Sometimes when you're doing a piece like this, and especially when it takes so long, this took me about 6 to 7 hours. It's good to be able to pace yourself and just have a bit of a plan in mind to reward yourself after drawing some difficult areas. So for me, the reason I don't just focus on one area at once is I get a little overwhelmed, and I like to set myself little rewards throughout a drawing just to keep the pace up, I guess. Do you guys do anything similar to that? Do you have your own routines or regimes to work through a picture that's obviously going to take a while? But once that had been finished, it was just time to again refine those edges and then start adding some more details on there. I wanted the border to just not be quite as white because I thought it was just a little bit conflicting with what was going on in the centre of the piece there, and I quite liked the fact I'd made that decision and gone ahead with it, and I liked how it looked. I think having the stark white there really would have conflicted with the Empress and the Spirit on there, so that was my reason for doing that. And using the Pip pen just ensured I could do it quickly and it wouldn't be as streaky, although sometimes these pens will just be streaky. For the scales, I thought I would have them looking a little bit like a beaded chain because I just thought that would be a nice bit of texture in the background there. I originally was going to leave it as those white lines, but again, a bit of texture is not a bad thing, and those particular areas behind the scales didn't have much going on, so that texture just added a little something that was missing there. We're at the stage now where it's just time to add a bit of grey on the circus tent as well as on the moth's wings, just to make it look like a moth. And yeah, I know the wings are a little bit janky on there, but you know, that's okay. We can say that's also part of the wild prompt too, right? It was also time to just refine those slugs, snails and scorpion there too, just so they just didn't look a little bit odd compared to everything else. And I thought as well for the Empress's boots, I'd also have them black. I do end up making a little bit of a mistake here, and I do try and rectify it by using a jelly roll pen, but no, they were being a little bit temperamental that day, so I ended up doing it off camera because it was just misbehaving and I was getting a little bit frustrated with it. But yes, at this stage we are pretty much done after the boots. I really enjoyed doing this. I thought not only was it a great way to just do all of these prompts in one go, but it was fun. It was a challenge to try and make things tie together at least. I know some of them aren't massively obvious, but hey, you know what? If you've made it this far, you'll have heard the explanation. My favourite part on this is the Empress, the Spirit and Death. I don't know why, I just like the composition there, and I kind of like the snooty look that she's got on her face too. But overall, again, I was just really happy with how everything turned out and I really enjoyed doing this. Anyway, there should be some more videos on screen if you want to watch some more of me doing arty things. I just want to say a massive thank you as always for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and I'll see you lovely lot soon. Bye!